Welcome to She Considers a Field podcast with coach, encourager, and fellow entrepreneur and homeschooling mama of four, Anna McLaughlin. As a homeschooling entrepreneur, you are uniquely positioned to impact the kingdom of God both deep through your investment in your children and wide through your business. And yet guilt, frustration, and overwhelm can hold you back from all that God has for you. Come with me on a journey to walk in deeper peace, purpose, and joy, because God has given you a legacy to build, and I'm here to help you enjoy the ride. Hello and welcome to this latest episode of She Considers a Field. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Okay, so I got 10 minutes into the episode I thought I was supposed to be recording for today, and I could not do it. It was like slogging through mud. I kept pausing. I kept trying to collect my thoughts. I've walked long enough with the Lord to know when there's that level of resistance, it's time to take a breath. So I reset the recording. Because see, y'all, I'm a talker. I am a talker. The Lord just kind of drops things into my brain, typically as my lips are moving. And so oftentimes I start out with an idea of what we're talking about. Maybe I've grabbed some scripture. I've definitely prayed. But much of where we end up is kind of a surprise to me as well. And I feel like in this season, that's kind of the invitation that the Lord set before me. So when I could not get it out of my mouth, I took a pause and I took a breath. I was like, what is it really? And I will tell you, what came to me was, I feel like crying. I feel like crying, and I have felt like crying. So I was like, what is it? Well, I'm recording this episode at the very beginning of October. And in the area in which I live, I'm about 2.5 hours from where all of the devastation hit for Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina. And I've had a hard time kind of knowing how to walk forward, knowing that very close at hand, there is a significant number of people, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, I'm sure, who are, in my mind, in my estimation, living their worst nightmare. How do we pick up and move on when there is that level of suffering going on among our next door neighbors? And I thought I would share, however imperfectly. I feel very humbled even trying to do this. I'm like, Lord, I don't know if I want to talk about this because it's such a hard conversation. I thought I would just share a story from my own life relating to reckoning with suffering. In case you find yourself in a similar space, maybe there's hard going on around you, and you're kind of in that like survival guilt of how do I show up tomorrow and minister in my sphere? How do I, maybe you've got a business and you're like, how do I talk about my product when people are hurting? Maybe you've got ordinary day-to-day life with taking care of the kids or with your marriage or whatever it is. Or maybe you've got just a little splinter of heartache. By your estimation, that's how you see it in this season, a little splinter of heartache. And you go, how am I supposed to ask for help and support from my best friend who's literally like living life like she's just had a heart attack's worth of suffering? How do I do that? And so I want to offer a story I've shared before from my life, and one that I love from literature from C.S. Lewis. And just trust that the word is coming at its proper season. Okay? So, one of the things that I have learned over the years, and I'm having to remind myself of this live. I'm like, I don't listen, when you come with me, you're in the middle of the process. This is what I'm reckoning with right now. I was literally sitting on a conference call with the ladies that I work with going, I don't even know how to show up right now because I know people are hurting. How do I talk about, something day to day like health and wellness when I know that people are suffering and like don't have houses right now? And what we connected on and what I was reminded of is the work is still the work every day. And we don't have to apologize for what our own unique story is, because all of life, each of us will have a measure of suffering in our lives. And we don't need to kind of compare battle scars right now and go, mine is worse, yours is worse, hers is worse, theirs is worse. Because the truth of the matter is that everybody will have their portion in their lives. And when we start to impose a judgment on our right to speak because we're not going through the worst right now, then we minimize our story. And this is really helpful for me to remember, we minimize others, because somebody's got a splinter right now, and theirs may be smaller than yours even. And they're sitting there going, oh, I can't get support. Who am I to ask for help right now? And when we do that, we minimize the power of God to minister to each of us in our unique space right now. Okay? So, how do we reckon with this suffering, friend? When we see someone across the aisle who maybe is hurting far worse than we are in our estimation. So first, I'm going to take you to one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture, and I've talked about it in here before. I'm not going to look it up. I'm just going to go from memory, but grab it because it is so good. The Horse and His Boy by C.S. Lewis. There's a young boy named Shasta, and he is going on this epic adventure far greater than he even understands or appreciates. That's kind of how God works, right? And he's supposed to tell the king that the bad guys are on their way, if I remember correctly. I can't remember exactly what he needs to tell them, but it's a very important message. As he is traveling, he finds himself in the middle of this fog, and all of a sudden he senses a presence beside him. He has no idea what it is, but he's terrified. Finally, he musters the courage to basically ask who's there. And the figure, who ends up being Aslan, of course, none of us are surprised, Aslan, who is the god figure in the Chronicles of Narnia, says this. And when Shasta says, who is it? He says, one who has waited long for you to speak. And then the lion invites Shasta. He says, tell me your sorrows. And Shasta starts detailing all of these terrible things that had happened to him. And they all involve this cat or this lion. And like, oh, he chased us and he scratched Erebus, who was his traveling companion. And we were in these tombs, and all of a sudden there was this cat, and it was really weird. And then we find out that it was the presence. It's Aslan. And he still hasn't been able to see this figure, right? It's Aslan. He says, it was I. It was all, there was only one lion, and it was me every time. I was the presence that went before you in each of those situations. Well, one of those things that lion did was scratch Erebus on the back. And so Shasta said, what were you doing? Like, if you're good, if you're not terrifying, but you're actually good, why did she suffer at your hand? And Aslan goes on to say, I tell no one anyone's story but their own. I tell no one anyone's story but their own. Again, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And we find out much later that those slashes that Aslan inflicted on Erebus were recompense for her deception and sin and the cost that fell to her lady's maid as a result. She had snuck away, and the lady's maid was blamed and given the same number of lashes that Erebus was then given. He tells us no one's story but our own. And of course, we aren't always, like, when we go through hard trials, it's not always, and I don't even think we could say often or not, it's not always at our own hand, right? The suffering that we go through is on a much broader scale, rooted in the fact that we live in a broken world where there's sin, where there's damage, where there are natural disasters, and there are influences that are so far beyond our scope of understanding and ability to see that we can't even capture all the roads that we might have to walk, and all the things that might befall us, and why and wherefore and all of that. But here's what I learned from that passage, and from a story from my own life that I'll tell you in just a second. We can't begin to understand why we walk the roads that we walk. But there is this promise that we can bank on 110% every time. Whatever road we walk, we can take to the bank the promise of Romans 8:28. He works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purposes. All things. All things. Not some things, not sometimes, not some ways, not if he feels like it, not if the wind blows right, not if we're faithful enough. When we are in Christ, no matter how devastating the story, no matter how impossible it seems that there can be any shred of good, he promises that he works it to good, period. End of story. That's it. A pastor of mine several years ago, he worked for a very large church. He was a pastor for a very large church for a time. And he was sharing with us this season in ministry where he said someone was just always dying. When you pastored a large church, there was always a deathbed that there was to go visit. And he was going through a season where there was a particularly high number. Just every time he turned around, somebody else was sick, somebody else was dying, and he was just back to the hospital, back to the hospital. And he details leaving the hospital one night and crying out to the Lord and saying, I can't do this anymore. And he said, the Lord whispered to his spirit, your soul is too small. I've carried that phrase with me so many times, and I'm holding it in my heart right now, and I'm tearing up just talking to you guys about this, because it is that hard to reckon with sometimes when we see the depth of suffering that mankind endures at times. All the time, right? We're just not always aware of it. Our soul is too small. Our understanding of God, I mean, the way I would say it to myself is, my God is too small in those moments. And what I mean by that is our understanding of God is too small. We cannot conceive of his redemptive power in a given moment. When we behold that suffering, we can't begin to imagine how it could possibly be turned to good. You know, in my world right now, people have lost everything. Their houses are floating by on water. People have lost their lives. The stories are so devastating that it can be crippling to even behold it. I get it. Obviously, I'm in it, right? And I know that all of us are at one time or another, where we almost can't even wrap our brains around that level of hurt and despair. But our souls are too small. We don't see the big picture the way that he does. Think about a child, how they feel when they lose a board game or they can't find their favorite toy. One of my kids is very visual. So when one of his things is missing, it is apocalyptic. It is the end of the world as we know it, and he is not fine. Okay? Absolute tragedy. And you know what'll happen? He will lose his ever-loving mind, and then about 30 seconds later, oh, I found it. And I'm like, dude, you have got to remember the okayness that you feel in this moment and pull it back about 30 seconds. You were still okay before you knew where it was. You just didn't know you were okay. We have to recognize our scope is too small. All we see, and not to diminish this, but all we see is those 75-ish years that we get to be on earth. And we go through something and it feels like life is over. But we've lost sight of the reality of forever. Forever. If we all gave up as soon as it started to hurt in the middle of a workout, think about how weak we'd be. If we all gave up with that first argument that we encounter with a friend or loved one, think about how empty our lives would be. This life is a breath. Paul talks about our sufferings being light and momentary in the middle of talking about persecution of the church. Talk about a hard walk. That this most precious faith that they're holding on to with everything in them will actually be the source of their deepest suffering on this life, in this life. But it's light. It's light in comparison with the glory that awaits. Our scope is too small. Our souls are too small. And I told you I would share a story from my own life. I learned this best with the passing of my dad. This is the part of the inheritance that he gave me. When I was 14, actually, I take it back a year. When I was 13, my dad had a cold. He felt real rough, couldn't shake it. Every day he'd wake up and he said to me when he dropped me off for school one day, I think it was a Wednesday, every day I wake up and I just wonder, am I going to be able to get through the day or do I need to go back to the doctor's office again? Drop me off at school. I love you. Love you too. 10th period, his wife comes to school, comes to grab me. She says, your dad's in the hospital. He had acute lymphocytic leukemia, which at the time was 100% fatal to adults. It was a child's leukemia at the time. It still is. Primarily a child's leukemia, but when adults got it, it was bad. So at the time, there was no path forward. But there was a clinical trial, and he got on it. Half the people died that were on the clinical trial. Half survived, but half of those that survived, including my dad, were left with a spinal cord injury. For him, he was headed to bed one night. He couldn't feel his feet. He woke up the next morning and was paralyzed from the waist down. And that was the rest of his life, 26 years. To say that that rocked my world was an understatement. The trauma from that, he's okay, he's going to die. Now he's paralyzed forever. It followed me into my marriage and my relationship with my children. It took a really long time for me to get to the other side of that. And throughout the years to follow, there was this constant fear that something was going to happen to him. His life felt so fragile. And he would go into the hospital regularly with complications from his paralysis. Every time he would go in, it felt like the bottom was dropping. His passing loomed so large in my life that there were seasons where just getting a phone call from him set me into shakes and these like reverberations of fear before I even picked up the phone. Because so often when I picked up the phone, when they were calling, it was because he was being hospitalized for something. So when the time came for him to pass away, I was sure I wasn't going to get to the other side. There had been so much fear for so long. The fear of his passing had been almost otherworldly in its magnitude. This kind of like ever-present ache and like, how can we even, I can't even, obviously I can't even put words around it. So devastating was I sure that it would be, that I didn't know how I was going to make it to the other side. And then, y'all, I don't know if I've told you this part of the story. He got in a car accident, a little routine fender bender on the way back from a doctor's appointment. And what followed from that was a cascade of events that resulted in his passing about a week and a half later. So here's this thing I swore I'd never get through. And do you know what waited on the other side of his death? The greatest love I've ever experienced from God the Father and from my earthly father. I don't understand it. I can't wrap my arms around it. But on the other side of my dad's passing was this grace and peace. I woke up the morning after he died and I was in prayer. And the only way I know how to explain it is the veil between heaven and earth felt so thin. I felt like I could almost touch it. That other side, that forever. And as I was talking to the Lord that morning, I was like, I feel like if I don't have you at every single breath, that I'm not going to make it. And the Lord said, peace and joy are your inheritance from your Father. And I will say that I know the Lord in a way that I never did before his death, September 30th, 2021. marks a before and after in my life that is absolutely immutable. It cannot be changed. It cannot be taken away. It cannot be lost. My life was never the same in the most beautiful of ways, but I had no way of knowing that's what was waiting for me. The best way I know how to describe it, we're back to C.S. Lewis again. We're right back. Maybe we'll just stay here forever, right in C.S. Lewis land, because man, did that guy know the gospel. And that's what he offered to us. Such beautiful words. There's this picture in The Silver Chair where Jill Pole blew it. She is Eustace's friend, and she comes into Narnia, and she decides that she's too cool for school, and she's going to kind of like tease Eustace by being overly bold on the edge of this cliff. Eustace ends up falling, but he doesn't drop. The lion, Aslan, comes and breathes his breath and basically holds Eustace up for the whole journey into Narnia. And then Jill gets her ride. You think you're going down, but the breath of God holds you and creates this gentle support undergirding you, where it's like you can't even be scared because you are that protected by a force that is greater than you could ever imagine. So bringing it back, how do we reckon with suffering? We have to be aware that if Romans 8:28 is true, if we can take it to the bank truly, then we have no way of knowing or even comprehending the depth of love and support that is holding up another person when they're going through their hard. And we run the risk of actually hurting their own gift when we look at them and say, how are you even making it through this? Because see, they may not know that promise, but it's available to them. And when we instead look at somebody, and no matter how big the hurt is, no matter how insurmountable, no matter how unimaginable it might be, if we can look at them and go, I don't know how this is going to play out, but I know the God you serve, and I know he's got you one way or another. And I'm right here for the miracle that's awaiting. We're not going to let go. We're going to hold fast to the promise of Romans 8:28 that he's going to work this for good somehow. It doesn't look like it right now. I know it doesn't make any sense, but I'm going to believe that for your sweet life because I know how big he is. Okay? I wouldn't do this with just anybody. But our heart to heart, our nearest and dearest, may we not sacrifice their own life-giving offering from the Father at the expense of our own judgments. We think it's insurmountable. We can't imagine navigating through that thing. But let us not put our own judgments on them and bring doubt. Let's lift them up and say, I know the God that you serve. And he, you know what? He's just going to have to be bigger. He already is, right? But our view of him, right? Our souls are too small. Our view of him is going to have to grow, where we know not only can I breathe through this, but I can thrive. I can thrive. There's something even bigger waiting of his love, of his peace, of his joy, of his presence. Y'all, we think we've got it all. We don't have it all yet. We do not have it all until we see him face to face in glory. So our souls expand with every suffering. I'm going to say that again because, man, I need to know it. I don't know about you. Our souls expand with every suffering. Okay? He makes this promise in the Gospels, right? The Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the brokenhearted, for they will see God. He knows the loss. And I'm going to say it this way. I hope you know what I mean. He always pays his debts. Does he owe us anything? No. He owes us nothing. But as only a loving father can, he sees the pain that we're going through, and he says, I'm going to give you something even better. It's going to blow your mind. So we have to watch our judgments, that we not look across the aisle at someone else who's hurting and say, how are you even standing? Instead, let us show up in love and compassion. Compassion comes from com, means with in Latin. Patior, I think it is. Passasum. That's that's the participle. Okay, sorry, y'all. Sorry, coming back. Okay. It means suffer. So we suffer with people, not by going down the mountain with them, right? Not by like landing in the valley in a big heap and going, how awful for you. How are you even standing? But to stand alongside them and to look up. Say, I know the God that you serve and that I serve. I'm holding out. Like we talked about in the past with Elijah, where he sees that rain is coming before anything in the natural reveals that it is. And again, he sends his servant up the hill, look again. And when he sees the cloud the size of a man's hand, he says, tell the king it's going to rain. We need to believe that, not just when we're looking for the good thing, but when we're looking for the lifeline. I know it's coming. Why? Because his word says it is. Because he tells us all things for good. I work together, all things for good. These tragedies too. All things is all things. Okay. So we have to watch our judgments. We have to show up with love and compassion and help turn the hearts of the people to the goodness of God. Say, I know he's got you. I know it may not look like it right now, but he has got you. And this story isn't over until it's good. Okay. May not even be in this life, but our sufferings are short and light compared with the weight of glory that is to come. Okay. And when we've done that work, then we move our feet and do our part. No one else's part but our own. And this brings us back to what we're all about here. What is our unique gifting? Friend, what is your unique gifting? What is your unique skill? What is your unique calling? Okay. Right now, with what's going on with the hurricanes near our area, I'm watching people go out with chainsaws and four-wheelers, and they're driving their big rigs to send support and help. And I'm sitting there going, I got nothing. I got nothing. And I don't in those respects, but I can pray. I can send love and compassion. I can believe that redemption is coming, even in the middle of this hard story. And I'm looking for what else? Lord, does anybody need a life coach out there? Will you connect me with them? Lord, does anybody need an encourager or a prayer warrior? Does anybody need a strategist? Send me. Help me serve. That's my prayer because those are my gifts. What about you? We show up where we're called. We move our feet and we do our part. And we hold fast, so fast to that promise. He works all things together for good. We will believe it. Oh, let this be so. We will believe it when no one else will. And by believing it, I believe we release heaven's power all the more clearly for it to do its work. Okay. Now, that's what I got. I hope this serves. I don't even know. I'm like, what the heck did I just say? I don't know. If you heard this, if it encouraged you in any way, let me know. It helps to know. It helps to know someone heard it. And in the meantime, and most importantly, until next time, friend, you've got this because he's got you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of She Considers a Field. If you found value in this episode, I would be so grateful if you would leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and be sure to share with a friend who needs some encouragement on her journey today too. Until next time, remember, you've got this because he's got you.